Ladies and gentlemen, I am OmnusI. Welcome to my lair. Today we are here for another RPGaDay video for 2020. The day is the 19th. The topic for today is Tower. Now, in role-playing games, a tower is often treated as an upside-down dungeon. The idea being that in a dungeon, you enter into the dungeon, and the uppermost layer is the one where you're going to find the weakest monsters. The kind of things that adventurers sharpen their teeth on. As you get lower in the dungeon, things get more powerful. You start facing tougher monsters that don't want the hassle of dealing with low-level adventurers all the time, so they use the monsters in the upper levels as kind of their gate guardians. And then, as they go further and further, they reap the rewards of facing tougher and tougher monsters until they've either exceeded how tough they really are and get rolled by powerful monsters, or they get down to the point where it's time to fall back, train, power up, etc., etc. Towers generally work in reverse. You start at the ground level where the entry-level monsters and guardians are, and you work your way up to eventually getting to the top where the most powerful creatures are, the big bad evil guy, the boss of the dungeon, what have you. It's a trope that's old as time. Well, as old as we've been telling these stories to each other, quite honestly. So, the idea of tower, to me, means an escalation. It means ramping up your difficulties as you go along. One of the things that I've learned over the ages is that every single game has some sort of mechanical means of representing greater challenges. Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, monsters have better hit points, better to hit, so more likely to hurt you unless you have armor that gets tougher and tougher to hit, more damage that they're capable of doing to match all those extra hit points that you now have. So realistically, a first-level character fighting first-level monsters faces roughly the same challenge as a 10th level character facing 10th level monsters. It's actually not hard math. Converting games is actually relatively easy once you understand those concepts that just keep increasing everything. So as players get better in all areas, the monsters get stronger in all areas, and boom! You can make any kind of monster that you can imagine just by applying those principles. Where in a character's lifespan do you want them to have to deal with this monster? Is it something that you want to save for mid-level? Then it's going to have mid-level stats. Quite a number of hit points so it can survive a party alpha strike and weather that for a round or two. And have the ability to deal out damage that is scary enough that a single player isn't going to want to take repeated attacks from it, but not so deadly that it'll kill somebody in one shot. Give it a special ability that can scare the group for a bit, may disable somebody for a little while, but ultimately can be overcome by clever thinking. These are all different things that you can do to create your own monsters. I will be doing a video on this because I think it's important for home brewing and, quite honestly, reskinning purposes. But in terms of that scale, every game has a little bit different scale, quite honestly. For instance, the Star Wars D6 game for West End Games has a base level for your common person. So anybody who you attempt to overcome as a basic person, you can figure out the numbers for. Your average person has 2 dice stats across the board, so when you're competing against people who aren't particularly good, as if you are a starting hero, you might be competing against a result of 2 die 6 rolled, maybe with some bonuses. If it's something that they're supposed to be pretty good at, they may have a 3 dice or 4 dice to roll, giving you elevated numbers to challenge against. It's not rocket science. It's actually fairly straightforward. And I've always based the enemies that my players are going to face based on their own stats. As the player's blaster skills, for example, gets higher and higher, your enemies are going to want to use cover more often and have dodges that might actually make it difficult for them to be hit. If you are playing in a game and things are scaled appropriately, you're going to feel like it's a struggle, but that you can ultimately win. And that creates drama and focuses interest. You think that there's a risk of failing. That's important. If there's no chance of failing, then sorry. Unless it's because you're very clever and you stopped any chance of failing, you should be able to enjoy those rewards too. My compliments to you for outthinking a scenario. It's great when you do that, isn't it? But knowing how to scale your difficulties is important to understanding how to master a game. That's honestly why I think game mastering is called game mastering. It's knowing the game inside and out and knowing what you have to do to tell a good story, to run an excellent adventure for your players. You can master a game and not understand the game very well, and it's going to be challenging for you to do that. You're often going to have to rely on other skills rather than knowledge of the rules to make it entertaining. Maybe you yourself are very good at entertaining. Maybe your group gives you a lot of good feedback to work with, and therefore you can even go off the rails somewhat and still have people who are happy at the end of the session. And that's good. If you're a game master and you can get away with doing that, your improv skills are going to get better and better and better, and you will be better at game mastering, at taking in, knowing the rules better, and having those improv skills. It's great. But when you're designing a game, you want to understand how you can come up with this scale balance. Now, for my game, it's relatively straightforward, because most of your dice rolls are going to generate a number between... Well, 1 is always going to fail, and it's generally going to be a critical failure, but between 1 and 8 most of the time, maybe a bit higher. The major reason being that if, say, you roll an 8-sided die, which is the best die that you can use as a starting character, if you roll supporting dice, like a geared die, and you roll the maximum value on that die, it adds a +1 to whatever the highest die roll is going to be. So if you have a D6 sword, and you roll a D8 for your sword swinging skill, and you roll a 3 for your sword swinging skill, but a 6 for your sword, the 6 is the best, so you'll take that, and because it's the maximum die result of a 6-sided die, it's +1, so that's a net 7. Your sword was really on point. It was balanced just right, and even though your swing wasn't particularly good, your sword was up to the blow. Yeah, that works. So you can get actually higher, potentially, than the value of your best die, but generally it's not going to happen too often. So, generally you're going to have a number range between 1 and 9. So, having a difficulty for just your everyday challenging thing of a 3, and something that's really tough to be a 6, not that bad. For something that's really heroic, you might need to get a 7 or an 8, but those are going to be really, really challenging things. And also, it's possible that you might shoot past that scale for things that require nearly superhuman abilities. For example, trying to move a dragon, trying to shove it, might require a difficulty of a 10 or an 11, meaning that if you don't have a brute strength skill of a D10, you've got no real chance of doing it. A D8 just isn't going to cut it. The dragon is too massive. But just shoving it off of your friend that it's lying on top of, with maybe magic or just the fact if your character does get to be Herculean in strength, you might be able to pull it off. Especially if you have a nice circumstantial bonus that provides you with some measure of protection against disaster, so the dragon doesn't just roll over you. You might be able to make something like that. So that kind of scale is relatively simple to build in. The other thing, too, is my game is going to provide both a diceless DM option, where the DM just worries about target numbers, lets the players roll everything. That can speed things up. It also lets the players feel like their dice are more important. Because realistically, when a DM rolls dice, it's just setting a number that the players are working against. So if you just arbitrarily set the number based on the relative difficulty, it's effectively the same thing. It's just, if you roll really, really well, it may, make a player feel like they have no real chance, especially if you don't use a screen and they can see what you rolled. Likewise, though, there is something special about watching the DM just pooch roll and just knowing you're going to crush it. That can be a good feeling, too. So there's both sides of the spectrum. But if your dice are hot as a DM, it can really frustrate your players. So going without using dice, perfectly fine. And the DM just has to track a few things then. They track difficulty numbers to, say, hit a target. They have to track difficulty numbers for not being hit by an enemy. That's the players rolling a defensive roll to avoid being hit. Or maybe just rolling a gear die if they're willing to let their armor take the blow for them, which is perfectly fine. So there are disparate elements of the game that allow people to customize it for the way they want to play, and I really do think that my game is going to be relatively unique in those aspects on how you can customize it to play it the way that you want to play. And if you want, as a dungeon master, story weaver, to roll dice, you can. Nothing wrong with it. It'll work just fine. The system is perfectly fine with you doing that. Then you would just need your own set of dice. And then if the kobold attacks, for instance, the kobold would roll a d4 for its attack, and maybe another d4 for its weapon. And that's it. You're generally going to have a number that's going to roll around 3 or 4 more most of the time, which is not a deadly challenge, but if the players pooch it, they may still take a hit from these little kobolds. Not a great danger, but still a danger, especially if there's masses of them. And masses, by the way, doesn't necessarily necessitate rolling lots of times. A mob of something, for instance, is still summed up by a single die roll. It just is a higher die roll than the individuals inside of it. So again, to save time for the storyteller. Story weaver. I'll get it eventually. I've been looking at some storyteller games, so it goes. So that's my take on Tower. It's about scaling. It's about a feeling of import as you do more and more outrageous things. An impending sense that the difficulty is going up and that you better be prepared for it because things can turn south quickly if you dare too much. I think is useful in a game for setting dramatic tension and really rewarding players with a sense of their character's accomplishments. So that's my take on this word. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. A few, metagaming ideas. But honestly, I delight in the metagaming. I love looking into rules and looking at the reasons why we do things and picking them apart and unwrapping them and repackaging them for people. So, hope you liked it. So, thank you very much. I'm OmnusI, and I'll see you next time we do another one of these RPGaDay videos. Thank you and farewell.